Welcome to the Real Free News audio podcast. Today, explore the biblical accounts of Jesus' virginal conception, examining its limited presence in Matthew and Luke, historical context in first-century Judea, cultural marriage norms, ethnic Levantine roots, prophetic interpretations, and ongoing scholarly debates on theology and historicity. The virgin birth of Jesus constitutes one of the most distinctive and debated elements of Christian doctrine, appearing explicitly only in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke within the New Testament. These accounts describe Mary, a young Jewish woman betrothed to Joseph, conceiving Jesus through the agency of the Holy Spirit without any human sexual intercourse. The narrative emphasizes Mary's virginity both before and during the pregnancy, presenting the conception as a miraculous divine intervention that fulfills perceived prophetic expectations while establishing Jesus' unique divine sonship. Scholars note that this story is absent from the earliest Gospel of Mark, from the writings of Paul, and from the Gospel of John, suggesting that it may represent a later theological development within early Christian communities rather than a universally attested tradition from the outset. Historical estimates place Mary's age at the time of Jesus' birth between 12 and 16 years, with the most common range narrowing to 13 to 15 or around 14 to 15. These figures derive from first-century Jewish customs in Judea and Galilee, where girls typically reached puberty around 12 to 13 and were betrothed shortly thereafter, often marrying and bearing children in their mid-teens. Joseph, by contrast, is estimated to have been in his late teens to mid-20s, possibly 18 to 25, reflecting the cultural pattern whereby men married after establishing economic stability through apprenticeship and trade, such as carpentry. The age difference of approximately 5 to 10 years aligned with normative practices of the period, though later apocryphal traditions portraying Joseph as an elderly widower have been widely rejected by modern scholarship as theological constructs intended to support the doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity. The ethnicity and physical appearance of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus are consistently understood as those of first-century Levantine Jews, characterized by olive to brown skin tones, dark hair, and dark eyes typical of Middle Eastern Semitic populations. Forensic reconstructions based on contemporary skeletal remains depict Jesus as resembling modern individuals from the Levant with ancient regional ancestry, rather than the lighter European features common in later Western artistic traditions. Genetic studies indicate that ancient Judeans shared substantial ancestry with Canaanite forebears, a heritage partially retained in both modern Jewish populations and regional groups, though diaspora admixture has introduced variation, particularly lighter features among some Ashkenazi communities. The application of modern racial categories to these figures remains anachronistic, yet the evidence firmly locates them within the indigenous Jewish population of Roman-era Judea and Galilee. Biblical sources and textual limitations. The explicit narrative of Jesus' virginal conception appears solely in Matthew 1 verses 18 to 25 and Luke 1 verses 26 to 38. Making it one of the least attested major Christian doctrines within the canonical New Testament. Matthew presents the story from Joseph's perspective, emphasizing angelic revelation and the fulfillment of prophecy, while Luke focuses on Mary's encounter with the angel Gabriel and her affirmative response. Neither Mark, the earliest gospel, nor the letters of Paul, the earliest Christian writings, mention any miraculous birth circumstances, referring instead to Jesus' origins in conventional terms such as being born of a woman, or descending from David through human lineage. The Gospel of John similarly begins with Jesus' pre-existence as the divine word rather than detailing his earthly conception. Significant discrepancies exist between the Matthean and Lucan accounts, including differing genealogies of Joseph, contrasting sequences of events following the birth, and varied geographical emphases. Matthew traces the family to Bethlehem with subsequent flight to Egypt, whereas Luke describes a journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem for a census, followed by a return to Nazareth after temple rites. These differences suggest that the two evangelists drew upon independent traditions, potentially shaping the narratives to address distinct theological concerns within their respective communities. Attempts to harmonize the accounts often require speculative reconstructions that go beyond the textual evidence provided. The citation of Isaiah 7 verse 14 as prophetic fulfillment further complicates the picture, as the original Hebrew context addresses an immediate sign to King Ahaz in the 8th century BCE, involving a young woman already pregnant in his time. The Hebrew term translated as virgin in Greek versions means primarily young woman of marriageable age, lacking the explicit connotation of sexual inexperience present in the New Testament application. Many scholars conclude that Matthew's use represents a typological interpretation rather than a direct prediction, applying a contemporary event from Isaiah's era to Jesus as a deeper messianic fulfillment, while Jewish interpretive traditions reject any messianic or virginal reading altogether. Cultural context of age and marriage in 1st century Judea. 1st century Jewish marriage practices in Judea and Galilee positioned girls for betrothal shortly after reaching puberty, typically around 12 to 13 years of age, with consummation and childbirth following soon after. Historical evidence from rabbinic sources and contemporary marriage contracts indicates that females commonly married in their early to mid-teens, while males delayed until achieving economic independence, often in their late teens to mid-20s. This pattern produced typical age gaps of 5 to 10 years, reflecting practical considerations of family support and household establishment in an agrarian society with high mortality rates and limited life expectancy. Mary's estimated age of 12 to 16 at Jesus' birth, most likely 14 to 15, conforms precisely to these cultural norms, as does Joseph's probable age range of 18 to 25. Later traditions deriving from 2nd century apocryphal texts that depict Joseph as significantly older served theological purposes related to Mary's perpetual virginity by explaining Jesus' siblings as children from a prior marriage. Modern historical analysis, however, finds these portrayals inconsistent with the physical demands of carpentry, extensive family travel, and broader patterns of male marriage age in the period, favoring instead the younger adult profile suggested by cultural evidence. The physical capacity for reproduction emerged earlier than modern societies deem socially or psychologically appropriate, with menarche historically occurring around 14 and fertility possible shortly thereafter. Ancient communities accepted adolescent motherhood as normative given shorter lifespans and economic necessities requiring early family formation. Contemporary shifts toward later marriage and childbearing reflect improved nutrition, lowering puberty age while education and economic structures delay full adulthood, creating a wider gap between biological capacity and societal readiness for parenting responsibilities. Ethnicity, appearance, and modern projections. Mary, Joseph, and Jesus belonged unequivocally to the Jewish population of 1st century Judea and Galilee, descendants of the tribe of Judah, and the Davidic line as presented in the Gospel genealogies. Their ethnic identity as Semitic Levantine Jews placed them within the indigenous population of the region under Roman administration, distinct from later Arab or European admixtures that characterize some modern descendant groups. Physical features typical of the period included olive to brown skin, dark curly hair, and dark eyes, consistent with forensic anthropological reconstructions derived from contemporary skeletal remains. Genetic research demonstrates substantial continuity between ancient Levantine populations and both modern Jewish communities and regional groups sharing Canaanite ancestry, though diaspora experiences introduced varying degrees of admixture. Ashkenazi populations often exhibit lighter features due to European historical interactions, while Mizrahi and Sephardi groups tend to retain darker characteristics closer to ancient norms. The common depiction of Jesus with European traits emerged from medieval and Renaissance artistic conventions rather than historical likelihood, contrasting sharply with evidence indicating he would have appeared indistinguishable from other Galilean Jews of his era. Modern attempts to categorize these figures using contemporary racial frameworks prove inherently anachronistic, as ancient identities centered on religious, cultural, and tribal affiliations rather than phenotypic classifications developed centuries later. The shared Levantine heritage underscores common ancestry patterns across populations with deep regional roots, while highlighting how migration and admixture have diversified appearances among descendant communities over 2 millennia. Theological and ethical considerations of divine action. The Annunciation narrative presents Mary's response to the angelic message as affirmative consent, traditionally interpreted as a free and graced acceptance essential to the Incarnation. Her declaration, "Let it be done to me according to your word," has been celebrated as exemplary obedience and cooperation with divine will. However, the significant power differential between a divine messenger and a young woman in a patriarchal society raises questions about the nature of consent under such circumstances, particularly when viewed through contemporary ethical lenses emphasizing autonomy and informed decision-making. Applying modern legal standards of age of consent, which range from 16 to 18 across jurisdictions, to the ancient narrative produces stark anachronistic contrasts. Any contemporary scenario involving impregnation of a minor below these ages, regardless of claimed consent or method, would constitute statutory rape in most legal frameworks, as minors are deemed incapable of valid consent. The miraculous non-sexual character of the conception described in the texts complicates direct analogies to human sexual assault, yet the outcome, pregnancy imposed upon a young teenager, invites critical examination of divine prerogative versus human vulnerability. Theological defenses maintain that divine actions transcend human moral categories and temporal legal systems, operating according to eternal purposes rather than cultural norms that evolve across history. Critics argue that omniscience would encompass awareness of future ethical developments, raising questions about why divine intervention aligned with ancient adolescent marriage patterns rather than anticipating later standards of maturity. These tensions highlight broader issues of cultural relativism in assessing ancient religious narratives against contemporary values of child protection and individual agency. Critical assessment of narrative coherence and historicity. The virgin birth accounts display internal inconsistencies and limited attestation that challenge claims of historical reliability. Discrepancies between Matthew and Luke extend beyond complementary details into potentially irreconcilable sequences of events, geographical movements, and genealogical records. The absence of any reference to miraculous conception in earlier Christian writings suggests the tradition may have developed gradually to address theological needs regarding Jesus' divine status amid competing messianic expectations. Comparative analysis reveals motifs of divine or unusual births across ancient cultures, though direct parallels to non-sexual virginal conception prove rare. Most mythological examples involve gods engaging in sexual acts with mortals, contrasting with the biblical emphasis on the Holy Spirit's overshadowing without physical contact. The reliance on a Greek translation of Isaiah that introduces the virgin connotation absent in the Hebrew original further underscores interpretive layers rather than straightforward prediction fulfillment. Ultimately, the narrative functions primarily as theological proclamation rather than verifiable historical report, lacking independent contemporary corroboration outside the late 1st century gospel texts. Its restricted appearance within the New Testament corpus, combined with textual variances and contextual reinterpretation of prophecy, positions it as a distinctive doctrinal development shaped by early Christian reflection on Jesus' identity. The story's enduring significance lies in its symbolic assertion of divine initiative in human salvation rather than in empirical historicity. Conclusion: Reflections on the Virgin Birth, Historicity, Theology, and Cultural Relativity. The virgin birth narrative encapsulates profound theological claims about divine human encounter while revealing the complexities of interpreting ancient religious texts through historical and cultural lenses. Mary's youth and the circumstances of conception reflect normative 1st century Jewish practices that contrast sharply with modern ethical frameworks, highlighting the challenges of anachronistic judgment across vastly different social contexts. The limited textual attestation and internal discrepancies underscore the narrative's character as theological interpretation rather than universally attested historical event. Ethnic and physical reconstructions firmly situate Jesus and his parents within the Levantine Jewish population of their era, resisting later European artistic idealizations that obscure historical reality. Genetic continuity with ancient regional ancestry persists amid diaspora diversification, reminding contemporary observers of shared human heritage beneath doctrinal divisions. The story's motifs connect to broader ancient patterns of divine birth claims while maintaining distinctive non-sexual miraculous elements. Critical examination reveals a narrative rich in symbolic meaning yet fragile under strict historical scrutiny, inviting ongoing scholarly debate about faith, evidence, and interpretation. The virgin birth endures as a cornerstone of Christian identity precisely because it transcends empirical verification, functioning as proclamation of divine presence rather than documented biography. Its power lies in theological assertion amid acknowledged textual and historical limitations, continuing to provoke reflection on the intersection of miracle, culture, and human experience. Thank you for listening to the Real Free News podcast. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments section. Visit realfreenews.com for more Real Free News, and check out the Real Free News store for real free food and gear. Tune in again, and until then, remember to keep it real. Free news. Merry Christmas and see you next year.